Kevin Costner not being one of them, Kevin being a good guy. There were other people involved with that were not good guys to me. Once I said, hey, how about if we do this and that, maybe we could do some things together.
Kurt Russell sat down in front of a camera in January 2024, and without any particular fanfare, without any prompting from a grieving industry, without any calculated PR strategy guiding his words, he said something about Val Kilmer that cut straight through 30 years of Hollywood gossip and got to the truth of who that man actually was. He didn't soften it. He didn't hedge it. He looked back across 3 decades of memory and said what he saw. And what he saw was brilliance. What he saw was trust. What he saw was one of the most profound creative partnerships of his entire career, one that nobody had really given either of them enough credit for, because the story that Hollywood preferred to tell about Val Kilmer was always so much easier and so much more dramatic than the real one. The real one takes a little longer to tell. But it's worth every second. To understand what Kurt Russell revealed, you have to understand what Val Kilmer meant to the world of American cinema in the early 1990s, and why that meaning was always shadowed by a reputation that followed him everywhere like smoke. Kilmer had trained at Juilliard, the most prestigious performing arts conservatory in the United States, an institution that has produced some of the finest actors and musicians of the modern era. He graduated with that training deep in his bones, a commitment to craft that wasn't academic or theoretical but visceral and total. When Val Kilmer took a role, he didn't approach it as an assignment. He approached it as a full absorption. He became the character with a kind of ferocity that was, by most accounts, genuinely astonishing to witness up close, and genuinely exhausting to work around if you weren't prepared for what that meant on a day-to-day basis on set. Directors had spoken about it over the years. Co-stars had alluded to it in careful interviews. There were stories in circulation that had hardened into industry folklore by the time he was 30, tales of clashes over creative decisions, of Kilmer refusing to compromise on choices that he felt were essential to the character, of a stubbornness that came directly from his conviction that the work demanded absolute fidelity. Some of those stories were exaggerated. Some of them were probably fair. Most of them were true in the way that all complicated human truths are true, partially, contextually, without the full picture that makes any one person fully understandable. What was never in dispute was the talent. Even Kilmer's most vocal detractors in Hollywood were careful to separate the man's temperament from his ability on screen, because conflating the two would have required them to dismiss performances that were simply impossible to dismiss. His Jim Morrison in Oliver Stone's 1991 film The Doors was so convincing, so fully inhabited, that people who had known and worked with Morrison himself said watching Kilmer was disorienting. His Batman in the 1995 Joel Schumacher film brought a particular brooding intelligence to a role that had been defined entirely differently by his predecessor. And then there was Doc Holliday. And Doc Holliday was something else entirely. When Tombstone began production in 1993, it was already carrying more weight than most productions could bear. Kevin Jarre, the screenwriter who had written the script, and who had also written Glory, one of the most critically acclaimed historical films of the previous decade, had been set to direct his own material. That arrangement collapsed roughly a month into shooting. Jarre was removed from the director's chair, reportedly after the production fell significantly behind schedule and the sheer scope of what was being attempted proved overwhelming. Sets had been built. The full cast had assembled. Cameras had been rolling. And then the director was gone, and the film was in a state of genuine crisis. George Cosmatos, the Greek-Italian director who had helmed Rambo, First Blood Part 2 and Leviathan, was brought in as the replacement. He arrived with minimal preparation time. Some accounts suggest as little than 2 days to get his bearings before he was expected to begin directing one of the most logistically complex westerns in years. The situation required someone to fill the creative void, and the person who stepped into that void was Kurt Russell. Russell has spoken about this arrangement in interviews over the years, most clearly in a 2006 conversation where he confirmed what had been an open secret in the industry for a long time. He was, in essence, the creative force guiding the film's direction, spending his nights drafting detailed shot lists for the following day's filming, handing them to Cosmatos each morning, and then going in front of the camera to portray Wyatt Earp while carrying the invisible weight of the director's role simultaneously. It was an extraordinary act of creative dedication, the kind of behind-the-scenes investment that rarely gets acknowledged because it happened outside of any official title or credited role. Val Kilmer, years later, acknowledged it plainly and without any diplomatic hedging at all. In a lengthy blog post written in 2017, Kilmer addressed the question of Tombstone's direction directly. He had been asked about it for years by fans and journalists, and he decided the time had come to simply say what he knew to be true. His words were unambiguous. Kurt Russell, Kilmer wrote, was solely responsible for the film's success. No qualifications. No collaborative framing designed to spread the credit diplomatically. He named Russell as the person who saved the film, who stayed up night after night working on the production while everyone else slept, who sacrificed his own rest and his own creative energy to serve the story as a whole rather than simply protecting his performance as the lead. Kilmer was watching all of this in real time, and he was clearly moved by what he saw. He said that Russell had demonstrated the kind of effort and selflessness that very few people in Hollywood, or anywhere else, would have extended in that situation. And then he added the line that perhaps said everything. Everyone cared, Kilmer wrote, but Kurt put his money where his mouth was. That's a remarkable thing to say about a co-star. It's an even more remarkable thing to say about someone you supposedly had a difficult relationship with, someone whose reputation for being challenging on set was supposed to make the Tombstone set a powder keg waiting to ignite. And here was Kilmer, years after the cameras stopped rolling, offering public, permanent, unambiguous credit to the man he had worked alongside during one of the most turbulent productions either of them had ever experienced. Now come back to January 2024, and the GQ interview that would take on an entirely different weight in the months that followed. Kurt Russell sat with the magazine to reflect on his career, a career that spans more than 6 decades, from his early days as a child actor at Disney through the defining roles that made him one of the most beloved and respected figures in American cinema. Snake Plissken in Escape from New York. R.J. McCready in John Carpenter's The Thing. Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China. Wyatt Earp in Tombstone. A filmography that reads like a greatest hits of a particular kind of American cinematic identity. Rugged, intelligent, self-reliant, occasionally funny, always watchable. When the conversation turned to Tombstone and to Val Kilmer, Russell did not offer a careful, managed response. He addressed the subject head-on, acknowledging that yes, the reputation was real, that plenty had been said over the years about Kilmer being difficult to work with, and that the industry knew it. And then he did something that cut against every assumption people carried about what their dynamic must have been like. He described their working relationship as one of tremendous trust. Not strained trust, not hard-won trust, not the grudging mutual respect of two professionals who learned to tolerate each other's methods. Genuine, easy, natural trust, the kind that made their collaboration feel aligned rather than effortful. He said they were always thinking along the same lines. Creatively in sync. Moving toward the same vision of the film simultaneously, without needing to argue their way to a shared understanding because they were already there. For a production under that much pressure, with that much uncertainty baked into every single day of filming, that kind of creative alignment between the two leads was not merely helpful. It was, Russell suggested, absolutely essential to what the film became. And then he called the performance brilliant. Flat out, without qualification, without the kind of careful diplomatic hedging that public figures use when they want to seem complimentary while actually saying nothing specific. He said what Val Kilmer did with Doc Holliday was something very few actors could ever come close to touching. Coming from a man who has shared a screen with some of the most celebrated performers of the last half-century, that is not a casual observation. That is a precise and considered judgment from someone who was present every single day, who watched Kilmer work in real time, and who understood the full cost of what Kilmer was giving to create that performance. The timing of that interview matters enormously, and it is something that people discussed at length after April 2025. Russell made those comments in January 2024, more than a year before Kilmer passed away. He was not managing a legacy in the aftermath of grief. He was not offering a eulogy, not performing public mourning, not saying the things that people tend to say about someone they've lost because it would seem callous to say anything else. He was simply talking honestly about a man he respected, with no particular occasion demanding it and no particular agenda shaping his words. That makes everything he said more meaningful, not less. It was the truth told for its own sake, which is the only kind of truth that actually counts. The gift exchange that Russell described in that same interview became one of the most shared details from the conversation after Kilmer died, and it deserves to be, because it reveals something about both men that no interview quote ever could. When Tombstone wrapped filming, Russell wanted to give Kilmer something that reflected the experience they'd shared and the characters they had inhabited for months. He assembled a collection of Kilmer's props from the film, the holster, the gun, the hat, the iconic chair with Kilmer's name stenciled on the back, and had them photographed together into a proper keepsake. And then, in a touch that was equal parts dark, funny, and perfectly calibrated to the character of Doc Holliday, he purchased Val Kilmer a burial plot at Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona. Not a metaphorical burial plot. An actual plot of ground in the actual historic cemetery in the actual town of Tombstone, where real figures of the Old West are buried, the same Boot Hill referenced throughout the film itself. Russell's reasoning was entirely rooted in character logic. Doc Holliday was defined by death. The dying man who had nothing left to lose, who carried his own mortality around like a calling card, who could stare down anyone because he had already made peace with his own end. What better gift for the man who had channeled all of that darkness and wit and fearlessness than a place in the most famous graveyard in the American West? Here is where the story becomes something genuinely extraordinary. Val Kilmer, with zero knowledge of what Russell had planned, with no coordination between them, with not a single word exchanged about gifts or themes or symbolism, had also prepared something. When Russell found out what it was, the symmetry of it must have been almost surreal. Kilmer had purchased Kurt Russell an acre of land overlooking Boot Hill Graveyard. Not a place in the ground. Land above it. The living man's view down onto the dead. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them knew. They each instinctively reached for the same symbolic contrast, the grave and the view above it, death and life, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp, and arrived at the exact same idea from completely opposite directions. The man who played the dying outlaw gave land to the living marshal. The man who played the surviving lawman gave a plot in the ground to the dying man he had stood beside. The metaphor was perfect. The symmetry was complete. And neither of them had discussed a single word of it. Russell talked about that moment in the GQ interview with something close to wonder, that recognition of what the synchronicity meant, what it said about the kind of creative and emotional connection they had built during the making of that film. It wasn't a coincidence born of similar taste or similar cultural reference points. It was two people so genuinely tuned into the same frequency that they expressed their friendship in the same language without knowing the other was speaking it. On April 1, 2025, Val Kilmer passed away at the age of 65. His daughter Mercedes confirmed the news to the New York Times. The cause was pneumonia. Kilmer had been dealing with serious health challenges for years following his throat cancer diagnosis in 2014. His treatments had left lasting effects on his body. He had undergone 2 tracheotomies and had lost significant capacity to speak in his own voice. When he returned to screens in Top Gun: Maverick in 2022, reprising his role as Iceman more than 3.5 decades after the original film, his voice had been reconstructed using artificial intelligence technology. The fact that he chose to appear at all, that he showed up, that he was there, said everything that needed to be said about the man's commitment to the work, even when the work cost him more than most people will ever understand. The tributes that came after his death were substantial and genuine. Tom Cruise paused at CinemaCon to mark the loss. Francis Ford Coppola, Cher, Jim Carrey, and countless others offered public statements. Social media filled almost immediately with clips of his greatest moments. Doc Holliday's whispered "I'm your Huckleberry," Iceman's cold-eyed rivalry with Maverick, Morrison on stage at the Hollywood Bowl, Batman brooding in the shadows of Gotham. A career of extraordinary depth, played back for a world that was suddenly reminded of how rare that kind of talent actually is. And in the days following his death, the GQ interview resurfaced. People who had never seen it before found the clip of Russell describing their trusting relationship, calling Kilmer's performance brilliant, telling the story of the burial plot and the acre of land. It spread widely and quickly because it reframed the story people thought they knew, not as a eulogy constructed in the aftermath of loss, but as something Russell had said freely, honestly, and completely on the record more than a year before either of them knew how little time remained. It became a tribute that hadn't been designed as one, which made it far more powerful than anything that could have been written in the days immediately following Kilmer's death. What Kurt Russell revealed, ultimately, was not a scandal or a secret or a dramatic confession about feuds and chaos. What he revealed was far simpler and far more important than any of that. He revealed that the narrative people had built around Val Kilmer, the difficult actor, the impossible co-star, the brilliant but ultimately unworkable force of nature, was incomplete. That it captured something real about how Kilmer operated in certain environments, with certain people, under certain conditions, but that it missed the equally real truth of what he was capable of when he found the right collaboration, the right creative alignment, the right person willing to trust him as completely as he was willing to trust them. Kurt Russell was that person, on Tombstone, in 1993. And the film they made together, the one that emerged from chaos and crisis and the loss of a director and the invisible workload of a star who refused to let it fall apart, stands as one of the finest westerns in American cinema history. That is their shared legacy. That is what the truth looks like when you finally tell it whole. Val Kilmer deserved to be understood that way while he was alive. He was, in the end, exactly what Kurt Russell said he was: brilliant, trusted, and almost impossible to replace.